This evening, I want to talk about three aspects of Iran and the Middle East and the United States, if I may. A little bit about the background of the deep concern that we've all had about the potential for Iranian development of nuclear weapons. Something, too, about how and in what way the nuclear agreement came about. And then the third part is some of the consequences of our pulling out of that agreement and what we might be thinking about or should be thinking about for the future. A speech teacher of mine once said that all great Methodist sermons have three parts. And so this will not be a sermon on Methodism, but I love to borrow from good friends and from good ideas. Let me begin by noting that the United States played a fundamentally important role in Iran moving into the nuclear era. Indeed, President Eisenhower thought that the classic big bargain would be we would provide technical assistance and help to countries to find ways peacefully to use the atom if they would eschew using it for military purposes. And that bargain became indeed part of American policy and part of a policy we pursued it internationally in something called the Non-Proliferation Treaty at the end of the 1960s. There now are almost 191 members of that treaty. Only 3 countries haven't joined. And as a result, it is in many ways part of an international strategy widely accepted. Iran, under the Shah, became very interested in nuclear. Well, why would a country which produces so much oil and gas be interested in nuclear power? The simple reason was, at least ostensibly, because you could save your oil and gas for export and the generation of really solid currency income over a long period of time, while you met your own power needs in a way with nuclear power, particularly if you could deal effectively with the problems of safety and security. And that became a focus of imperial Iranian policy. At one point, that policy comprehended 22 nuclear power plants in Iran. And those of us who watched carefully noted at least that the Shah was very careful never to deny a long-term interest in the military use of nuclear energy. And of course, that program, interestingly enough, disappeared in the revolution in 78 and 79 that brought back, in effect, the theocratic rule to Iran, to the mullahs, and indeed to revolutionary Iran. It was fascinating that the decision then was that nuclear power was too expensive, too complex, and too diverting for Iran that was embarked on what it believed would be a fundamental change in how people in Iran thought, operated, and worked with their future government. And that remained pretty much the Iranian attitude even through the war, begun in our view largely by Iraq against Iran at the beginning of the 1980s. A devastating conflict, killed many, many people, went on until the end of the 1980s when it was resolved, I won't say settled, by an agreement brokered by the United Nations in the main, and which resulted in a United Nations Security Council ending that episode. Iran remained hesitant about moving forward in the nuclear era, but over time it did. Iran possessed a small reactor provided by the United States to make isotopes for medical purposes, for purposes of radiation. But beyond that, it did little until the late 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. Then we watched and saw a considerable expansion of Iranian interest in nuclear questions. First and foremost, the acquisition of a reactor, a large power reactor from Germany, which the United States worked very hard to, in fact, block. And Germany opted out, and the Iranians went to Russia, and over time, Russia agreed to complete the reactor. Their own technology didn't fit very well. It had to be completely rebuilt. But it was of concern. Russia, interestingly enough, while it's in the reactor business, is also in the non-proliferation business. So the Russians will not provide a reactor without having the contract to provide the fuel and without an absolute insistence that the fuel, once irradiated, comes back to Russia. And that's important because nuclear fuel, in the course of being irradiated, produces plutonium. And plutonium is a weapons material. Plutonium has to be separated from the other parts of the used fuel through a complicated chemical process, but it is not beyond the capacity of developing states to master that and indeed to use it as a source for weapons development. In addition to that, over a period of time, Iran acquired considerable technical support and materials from Pakistan. At that time, the Pakistan nuclear program was being led by a famous Dr. A.Q. Khan, who had worked for a while in Europe with the European consortium that had been leaders in the enrichment of uranium for nuclear fuel. If you know how to enrich uranium for nuclear fuel, which is a very low level of enrichment, you can continue on to make high enriched uranium, which is a fissile material for weapons. Dr. Khan left Urenco, the European consortium, with plans and indeed with technology, and developed the program of enrichment that led to the manufacture of nuclear weapons by Pakistan. This raised significant suspicions in the minds of many people about Iran and where it was going. This attention particularly was picked up in Europe. And interestingly enough, by the beginning of this century, Germany, France, and Britain began negotiations with Iran in an effort to put a stop to any military program by Iran. The United States followed those negotiations closely. It did not join them. We had no relations or talks with Iran following the revolution, as you know, in large measure to reactions about the incarceration of a significant number of American embassy employees for 444 days. That concern devolved through negotiations. Iran agreed in 2003 to stop all enrichment activities and did so for 2 years. The United States would not agree, as Iran felt the Europeans had led it to believe that if Iran showed good behavior for 2 years, it would be allowed to continue, but on a peaceful course, as it termed it. The U.S. felt that any enrichment by Iran was too dangerous. That dispute meant that the Europeans didn't agree with Iran, and that the Iranians began on their own, once again enriching uranium. From 168 centrifuges, the devices that spin uranium gas to siphon off the isotope that is useful in fissile materials for nuclear weapons, they began to build more and more. Clearly, these were on the old Pakistani pattern, were very inefficient, but nevertheless, with a large number, you can move ahead. Iran then later built an underground plant in Isfahan that had space for many thousands of centrifuges, and then later built tunnels under a nearby mountain, which also carved out underground large chambers for centrifuge enrichment, protected by 500 feet of solid rock overhead. Clearly, the Iranians were worried about attacks. Clearly, they took steps to prevent those from seeking a solution. This took us up to a period in which most of the negotiations were essentially about when could we meet again. That usually was resolved after a time to a year later, but there was never any real progress. They were stuck. Deep differences prevailed. The U.S. view continued to be no enrichment for Iran and no chemical separation of plutonium. The Europeans were slightly more open to a process in which Iran could be allowed to do some enrichment, but a very limited level, and it would be subject to international inspection. Those stuck negotiations remained in place until 2012. Partly, I think, as a result of a clear indication by the United States to Iran that we would be willing to consider some uranium enrichment tightly controlled and no plutonium separation, and we're not pursuing policies which the Iranians were deeply concerned about of regime change in Iran. Quiet private talks brokered by Oman, a small Arab country at the northern edge of the Arabian Gulf that had maintained good relations with Iran. Private confidential talks began between Americans and Iranians. Those talks went on into the middle of 2013. They made a great deal of progress in constructing a preliminary agreement. The negotiations at the level of 6 states fell in behind, and one of the U.S. biggest problems was how could it convince the other members of the Western negotiating team that it had achieved such a degree of progress that a preliminary agreement was in sight. France, always huffy, was miffed and took a stand that for a while stood in the way of progress, but by November of 2013, the preliminary agreement was reached and put in place, and several very important initial steps were taken. But the most important thing was that Iran and the negotiating parties, 6 on the other side, Russia, China, Britain, France, and Germany, and the United States and the EU, it was more than 6, but 6 was always the label used, would have 6 months to complete a final agreement. There were 4 postponements of 6 months, and in January 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was achieved as a complex but very important agreement relating in many ways that I think all of us who had followed this carefully were surprised about in terms of the extent both of the limitations fastened on Iran and the degree of inspection which was achieved. The agreement had a simple formula. Much of it took place against the backdrop of increasing international sanctions against Iran in the area of the Iranian economy. And those sanctions came about at roughly the same time as the former president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, had so badly mismanaged the Iranian economy that they added an extra spin in a negative direction, if I could put it that way. And the capstone of that pressure was the fact that by 2013, international oil prices began to decline seriously, in part because the U.S. was able to provide significant additional quantities of oil to itself and the international market through the program of fracking. These came together. Iran felt it was very important to get out from under the economic sanctions and agreed to a set of limitations. The principal limitations on Iran were that it would have at any one time no more than 300 kilograms of low enriched uranium, not enough, even if enriched to higher levels, to make a nuclear weapon. Other limitations were on the centrifuges it could use, the ways it could modernize centrifuges, and indeed how and in what way plutonium produced in Iranian reactors would be dealt with. The first step on that was to pull the reactor apart and pour concrete into its essential elements. And the second was that if Iran made any plutonium, they were limited to 1 kilogram, not enough to make a nuclear weapon, and they were required to export that if that's what they made. The inspection system was very complete. Full access at all times to all the Iranian facilities, access wherever the UN wished to go, including the military facilities. And despite complaints by other people, since the U.S. has left the agreement, the UN has visited at least 20 military facilities to make sure that Iran is not cheating. It was extremely valuable to have that agreement. The most far-reaching question was that not only did we inspect Iranian nuclear activities, we inspected their centrifuge production capacities. So we had double opportunities to be sure that things were well handled. And the final piece was that Iran could not import anything having any relationship to a nuclear program from overseas without the full approval of the people negotiating on the other side. This agreement was made part of a United Nations Security Council resolution in January of 2015 and went into effect. And since that time, the regular monthly reports of the UN inspection system have made it clear that Iran has remained in compliance. In addition to that, as a double check on the international system, the intelligence services of the United States, plus friends and allies and other negotiating parties, made their own checks and have not come up with any reason to believe that Iran was not in compliance with the agreement. As you know, the president ran on his concern that for some reason, not yet fully clear in my mind, he had concerns about the agreement. One aspect of the agreement, I think, was problematic but not fatal, that the limitations on the amount of uranium Iran could enrich lasted 15 years only. The second was that the agreement did not cover a whole host of other activities by Iran, principally including ballistic missile development that everybody would have liked to have seen curbed. In part, that was true because the United States made a conscious decision that if it extended the scope of the agreement, it would take much longer to negotiate, and we would have to pay in dumbing down limitations on the nuclear program if we thought we could get limitations on ballistic missile testing. And the general view was ballistic missiles are not child's toys, but without a nuclear warhead, they are much less dangerous than if they had one. So it was better to focus on the warhead and get back to the missiles later on. The president, as you know, said he was deeply concerned by what he called the flawed agreement. He studied this. It remained a question under consideration until May 8th, 2018, when he took the United States out of the agreement. Taking the United States out of the agreement was in fact a violation of the agreement. The agreement was put together with no capacity on any party to withdraw prior to the time deadlines being expired, in large measure because serious distrust of Iran made it clear that we didn't want Iran to go in the agreement and then at some short time later waltz out. We got caught, if you like, by the restrictions that we put in. The president promised a grand new and seriously important negotiation for an improved and advanced agreement. So far, we haven't seen that. That was a promise that was coupled with the idea of getting out of the agreement. All of us who followed this closely in the main were mystified by the idea that since you had an agreement that was working well and held Iran in place on nuclear weapons for a minimum of 15 years, why you would tear up that agreement and then seek to renegotiate it all, particularly when all of the negotiating partners on our side thought we were loony to do it and didn't believe that they would implement international sanctions to try to get, quote, a better agreement, particularly because they had no idea what the president was proposing. So we are in a fascinating situation now. The agreement remains in force because while Iran, with our withdrawal, in violation of the agreement under international law, had the right to withdraw itself, it has kept the agreement with our European partners, Russia and China, on the other side, none of whom have joined us in moving out. In the meantime, we have tried to increase American sanctions on Iran. It's fascinating. People did not know that in the original agreement in 2015, all direct American sanctions on Iran for its nuclear program remained in place. The only sanctions we took off were on our friends and allies doing business with Iran, which was clearly important to the Iranians and our friends and allies at that point to be a sufficient counterpart to the limitations on Iran. That particular interesting process is still going ahead. The UN is still reporting that the Iranians are in compliance. And so, in effect, we have now entered into a new phase. We have put sanctions back on mainly our European friends and allies so that they cannot use dollars to trade with Iran. They cannot have their firms and banks trade with Iran and still do business in the United States. This is, in a way, a kind of perfect reversal of where we have been. Russia and China are now in a position freely to become best friends with Iran. We have put in place sanctions which help Mr. Putin achieve one of his principal objectives, to drive wedges between the United States and our European allies. And this, coupled with the disparagement that we have seen of NATO, changes radically where we are. So the questions looking ahead are interesting. One of those questions is, how long will Iran and the Europeans stay in the deal? We don't know. There is some indication that the Iranians have looked at the American political process, which they know well, and believe sort of that by 2020 there may be a different result. I'm not sure anybody knows the answer to that question, but hanging on until 2020 would not be a terrible strategy if, in fact, we want to keep Iran away from a nuclear weapon. The second issue is, will Iran derive enough economic benefit in its own view from the very limited trade with the European countries and at least a temporary step on the part of the United States to allow 8 countries, including India and China, a limited amount of oil trade with Iran as part of a process, in fact, of keeping our relationship with those countries in reasonable shape as we go ahead. We don't know. Those relations on the 8 countries end on the 8th of May, and it'll be interesting to see whether, in fact, the United States wants to close down that part of the oil trade entirely, reduce the amount that those countries trade, or continue with the same restrictions. My sense is, from what the administration has said, they either want to shut it down entirely or reduce significantly the amount of trade that continues. So we're now in a situation where we have almost no control over what is likely to happen. We have a situation where we have serious problems with our friends and allies, and we have clearly a situation in which Iran has at least the capacity to use a growing friendly relationship with Russia and China to work against us. All of this in the midst of a very fraught and vexing set of situations in the Middle East. We only have to kind of canvass the region, which I'll do lightly, because it is important that what happens with Iran on the nuclear question also be looked at in terms of how and in what way the Middle East seems to be unraveling without much help to make things move ahead. Starting at the oldest and most long-standing question in the Middle East, will Israel and the Palestinians reach some kind of an agreement which will recognize that each of them has a state in the old former British Mandate of Palestine and proceed ahead, opening the door to, I think, a firmer ratification of Israel's security on the one hand, and the possibility of even closer relations between the Arab world and Israel, which is likely to follow. That issue is going nowhere. And the U.S., over recent months, has made a series of steps, including moving the embassy, ending our consular relationship with the Palestinians, the president's step on the Golan Heights recently, and potentially future steps on recognizing that Israel can absorb at least a significant piece of the West Bank called Area C as potentially in the offing. This is changing radically the ground rules, and it makes it increasingly hard to see a negotiated end to the conflict with a reasonable and, I think, just position on how and in what way both Israel and the Palestinians can coexist in separate states in the region. Many difficult problems to solve. The president has promised a solution to the deal of the century. In the meantime, the U.S. has been creating new facts on the ground, ostensibly in part to ratify the close relationship that President Trump feels for Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is incidentally going to stand for election again on April the 9th. So all of this is a fascinating play in diplomacy. The second issue, which clearly involves Iran, is Syria, a country which has now lost 500,000 people killed, 10 million displaced. Certainly Russian intervention, Iranian intervention, Iranian use of a Lebanese military political party called Hezbollah to do fighting on the ground, U.S. intervention to block the presence and the expansion of the Islamic State, particularly in northeast Syria, the enlistment by the United States of Kurdish fighters and some Arabs to, in fact, carry out the ground warfare against the Islamic State, serious Turkish concerns about any arming of Kurds or any use of Kurds in a military capacity, particularly close to their border, and, of course, deconfliction, if I can call it that way, between U.S. air activity and Russian air activity. And finally, to add to the complexity, a deep Israeli concern about Iranian growing presence in Syria and the role of Hezbollah, including the importation perhaps of 100,000 missiles, short and medium range, in the hands of a group that could use those, Hezbollah, to attack Israel. Well, that is, in my view, the simple explanation of Syria. The complexities go much deeper. We don't have time for it, but the Iranian piece is important because for 2 years, the Israelis have been using standoff air attacks from over Lebanon to destroy the importation of technical military equipment into Syria, which they feel would threaten them. And they have made it very clear that any Iranian or Hezbollah moves closer to Israel, they will use military force to reject. The Israelis also will have to contend potentially with Iranian presence which cannot be dealt with by standoff attacks, and they will have to deal with quite a formidable Syrian air defense system to be able to do that. Not a comfortable situation for Israelis, not a comfortable situation for the region, and not certainly a comfortable situation with respect to Iran. It is also clear that there is some contention between Russia and Iran as to who will emerge at some future time as the strongest friend of the now Bashar Assad Syrian government, and deep uncertainties as to whether that war can be won on the ground. Many believe it is almost there, I have more reservations about it, and whether in effect, if the war does continue, there can be a negotiated solution in which the United States so far has refused to participate, but where I think both the United States occupy the position of being necessary parties, but not sufficient on their own to get a deal worked out. And so we have to deal with that problem, I think, if we're going to do anything further. I don't want to do more than point out those two complicating and deeply important situations that we've all followed at one time or another for a long period, to go back and say the future with Iran has become even more important. Our traditional concerns about Iran have always centered on nuclear weapons, are increasingly now looking at the ballistic missile testing program. Iran has not developed an intercontinental ballistic missile, but it has missiles of a range to reach Israel and probably some portion of the territory of our friends and allies in Europe. We are deeply concerned by Iranian treatment of organizations in the Middle East which we have found to be terrorist, including particularly Hezbollah and to some extent Hamas, which exists in Gaza and which is in that respect supported by Iran. We have deep concerns about Iranian treatment of its own people, particularly its failure to respect minority religions present in Iran, and those, I have to tell you, are the centerpiece of where we are. The fascinating and indeed the deeply disturbing thing is that with our withdrawal from the agreement, and indeed with the reluctance of our government now to have any contact with Iran, we have no way of communicating or opening negotiations except to proceed through Switzerland, which protects our interests in Iran, something that is normal and helpful, but not likely to be able to produce a quick answer to an accidental problem, which we all fear may in one way or another rile the situation. So closer, if I could put it this way, to conflict and concern. All of this is in many ways at the highest level made even more difficult by the fact that we have recently tried to improve our relationships with Saudi Arabia and have not reacted, at least in the executive branch, to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi or to Saudi activity in Yemen, although the Congress has taken steps to block some of the support we provide to the Saudis for that issue. Secondly, deeper in the background, but certainly looming as a strategic problem of the United States, is the deep division between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and Iran, a division which in no way at this stage seems amenable to any kind of a patch-up, but which clearly, were it to result in a conflict, would add a new and nearly genocidal set of competitions and military actions in the Gulf if it is not well handled. On the other hand, despite deep divisions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, both over the different professions and practices of Islam embodied in Sunni and Shia outlooks, and the long-standing difficulties between Persians and Arabs, there is no open channel or serious effort to move. What is best in U.S. interest is not another war in which we could be drawn in, certainly possible on the Saudi side. But what is, I think, potentially helpful, despite its distance from reality now, is to look forward to more balance in the region, more stability in the security for the countries involved, including Iran and Saudi Arabia, opening up some trade, and beginning in one way or another, not to aid and abet a competition for who is the biggest boy on the block of the Middle East, but the fact that it is a shared region with shared interests that gets along better if, in fact, it talks to each other than if it competes. The final point I'd like to make is whatever may happen with respect to the nuclear piece of the equation, it is very important for us to begin to think ahead. Because 15 years moves in the flick of an eye. And Iran, even if it were to keep the agreement for the 15 years, we should begin to think about what comes after. And what comes after can take three forms. One, a new agreement between Iran and some or all of the states that negotiated the previous agreement. A bilateral, multilateral arrangement. The second, at least theoretically, is to take a look at whether a regional agreement on nuclear questions would be useful. It's a great idea. The only problem is there is already a nuclear state in the region. And that nuclear state is highly unlikely to give up its weapons, particularly in a situation where the region is in worse rather than better state, and where it's highly unlikely that the degree of confidence that one would have to expect to give up a nuclear weapon is totally absent from the scene. The third might be to incorporate Iran, and indeed everyone else that we can bring on board, setting aside the hard cases of Israel, Pakistan, India. Hopefully we'll have something with North Korea, but we don't know. And use the basis of the principles of the Iranian agreement for an international arrangement governing enrichment and the separation of plutonium. Interestingly enough, for 20 years, the five recognized nuclear powers, China, Britain, France, Russia, and the United States, have an agreement among them that they will not make any more fissile material for nuclear weapons. And that has held. We know of no basis for believing it has not been abided by. And indeed, if those five nuclear powers have already given up the right to use centrifuges and reactors to make plutonium and highly enriched uranium for weapons, why not bring the rest of the international community on board as well? And there are some problem areas here. How can we assure, as we have with Iran, that the enrichment for power production can go ahead? Well, we have shown with Iran that we have a very good possibility of detecting any cheating, and that's useful. We could use a fuel bank to make that happen. We could use other selected states who are prepared to accept heavy international supervision to be the suppliers of nuclear fuel. We will need competition because we don't want to establish a monopoly for obvious commercial reasons. But this set of ideas is now being looked at. It's out there on the table, and it could be very useful because it would no longer treat Iran as a special case under deep suspicion, but a state like any other state willing to control its nuclear program along peaceful lines under a system which had a high possibility of clearly detecting any cheating. The second piece would be that it would bring many other countries in. Japan, which in various periods has floated with large amounts of has flirted with very large amounts of plutonium. Argentina and Brazil, which have looked at nuclear weapons. Countries that might want to make nuclear submarines, and there a special kind of plutonium enrichment is required, but it could be dealt with, I think, by an arrangement. So this is out there. It's something that I think could be useful. It may even be the answer to President Trump's better deal. The really interesting question is, can we get him interested in the better deal he's put forward? And can we find ways to move ahead? And there, if the five established nuclear powers can be sponsors of this arrangement, we are a long way down the road to getting there, because we're back to President Eisenhower's basic principle. We'll help you with technology if you stay away from making nuclear weapons, and making nuclear fuel has been a loophole, and stopping the making of nuclear fuel for weapons is a respectable, indeed advantageous approach to where we are. Well, I've taken you through a lot of science or pseudoscience, through a lot of discussion of a miserably difficult and vexed situation. I have offered you only a few bright clouds on the horizon, but that's the nature of things these days, unfortunately. And now I am going to throw myself on your gentle mercy and ask if you would have any questions at all, and I will do my best to attempt answers to them. Thank you for your time, for your attention, and for your presence. I believe circulating nearby you are others with microphones. So if you'd raise your hand, and I'll recognize this gentleman over here, and since I know only a few of you, I will try to avoid playing favorites. But would you identify yourself and any association and then state your question?
Marlon Cohn, Greater Kansas.
I don't think you're turned on.
Closer to my mouth.
Perfect.
Marlon Cohn with the Greater Kansas City People Organization. My question is that one of the reported components of the agreement with Iran was the United States delivery of a large amount of cash to Iran. Is that true? And if so, how much was it? And what is the purpose of that?
Yeah. The agreement provided that money sequestered under sanctions that was being paid to Iran for previous oil deliveries, which was Iranian property but not touchable under the sanctions regime, when the sanctions came off in the agreement, would be made available to Iran. It was, I think, in the nature of over $400 million, and it was clearly important in getting the agreement that Iran could get its money back if it behaved. And that's where it is. We provided no aid, no assistance, and no generosity.
My name is Mark Kasai. I'm the founder of a project company of Kansas City. First of all, thank you so much for your great presentation. It was very doable. My first comment is regarding the calling Arabian Gulf instead of Persian Gulf. Any reason for that? And the second question is, where do we stand in terms of the kind of double standards when it comes to supporting terrorism, when it comes to Saudi Arabia versus Iran?
I think that we all have problems with the Gulf. I usually just say the Gulf, and you know who I mean. I can obviously use interchangeable Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf. We have done that in the U.S. government. Feel no misapprehension. We know, in fact, that it is the Persian Arab or the Arab Persian Gulf. And let's make sure we're okay. On the question of double standards with respect to terrorism, I'm not sure exactly what you're talking about, but I've been around this world long enough to know that for many people, their freedom fighters are somebody else's terrorists. And so we have clearly difficulties in that regard. And so we could pick out whatever organization you want. If you like the Mujahideen al-Khalq, an organization which we have put on the terrorist list, an organization which, interestingly enough, has paid rather substantial fees to a number of people, including someone quite high up in the present administration, an organization that in its own past killed Americans, and an organization now which is deeply opposed to the present regime in Iran. Or we could look at Hezbollah or Hamas, and they have a record on the other side of the equation. So the U.S., I hope, will continue to stick by its view. It seems to be wavering on the MEK, the Mujahideen al-Khalq, but I hope it won't, because I think all of these sets of organizations have enough evidence against them to justify the continued finding of being terrorist organizations. And I hope that's straightforward and an answer to you. Thank you. Anybody on this side? This is the shy side. But maybe we can get you worked up. Yes, right here, please.
My name's Jones, and I have a as Iran is to move through and take advantage of power back, they've left, and we've sort of given our power over to Saudis, and Saudis decide so much. So, what is that really what Saudi Arabia is doing, or does it have a bigger plan? Or are they simply going to just wait and see what happens and hope that the United States will sort of come in and save them so they don't have to actually take responsibility in the region?
Did everybody hear the question? Let me just repeat what I think is the essence. Does Saudi Arabia have a plan for itself in the future in the region? And if so, what is it? And while I accept your question 100%, some of your conclusions in the questions we could debate, but we're not going to. Thank you. I think that Saudi Arabia has given every indication, one, that it would like to be the kingpin in the region with no opposition. Two, it would like to have this new and growing relationship with President Trump be the backup and maybe the front end of any activity that it might undertake which would involve a risk of conflict in the region. I can't tell you that for sure, but clearly our action in supporting Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and this was not the property of the Trump administration, it was the property of the Obama administration, has given people in Saudi Arabia at least some reason to believe that we will help the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman should he get in trouble or should he need an emergency SOS type assistance relationship. I'm not sure that we're there any longer. I think the Khashoggi murder and the congressional negative reaction to continued work in Yemen is going to help straighten this out. And if I were Mohammed bin Salman, I would say what you might have been confident about 4 months ago, you should be squeamish about now. Because I don't think this president, in all honesty, likes the idea of more wars. It's interesting. He may be pursuing policy that has a high propensity to get us there. But at the same time, I think he has made it clear that he wants to avoid that. So I constantly argue that our best posture is to find a way to see if we can help begin the process of resolving the conflicts rather than strengthening the differences. So far, unfortunately, I think our posture has been more to the latter than the former. But thank you for your question. Yes, right here, sir. Don't hesitate, ladies. Get the mics, because we have a lot of important questions here. Thank you.
Stephen Slaughter.
You're not turned on.
Stephen Slaughter, Thai Cultural Center.
Can you hear him? Okay, go ahead, please.
With certain war or peace friendliness with Iran and Saudi Arabia, neutrality towards the Qatar blockade, and a recent visit by Netanyahu last year, where is Oman present? Does Oman possibly have a future as a overseas broker, or are they just kind of?
It's a very good question. You mentioned the fact, and I neglected to put it on the table because of its additional complexities, but Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, among the Gulf states, have been in a feud with Qatar, in part because they believe that Qatar's television and radio system, Al Jazeera, has not been operating in their interests, in part because there's been a long-standing sense on the part of Saudi Arabia that Qatar is really just a junior partner, and most significantly because the Qataris have had continuing relationships with Iran. So Qatari air flights can't go over Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Gulf. In that regard, Oman continues in its own way to have this long-standing relationship with Iran. Iran, under the Shah, years ago, militarily helped Oman to defeat Yemen, its next-door neighbor, in a war. And so that relationship continues. Can Oman, under the present set of circumstances, be an effective go-between between Saudi Arabia and Iran? I don't believe so. I don't think the Saudi interest is there. But I was recently in Kuwait, and Kuwait sits up at the top end of the Gulf, and Kuwait is only 80 miles from Iran, and it has a common border with Saudi Arabia. And the Kuwaitis know that, in fact, a war would be a devastating development for them. They are Arabs and loyal to the Gulf Cooperation Group, of which they are part and which Saudis lead. But at the same time, they clearly have been trying to avoid this kind of conflict. And a year ago, they were kind of nominated quietly, interestingly enough, by the Gulf Cooperation states to see whether they could explore with Iran a possible step forward. That led to a visit to Kuwait by President Rouhani of Iran. And the Kuwaitis believe he made some significant promises of looking for a solution. But they said, in order to be effective, we need what you are telling us in writing. What they received in writing after a time was, from their perspective, very disappointing and not effective. So they are at the moment frozen in their ability to broker the kind of relationship which you asked about with respect to to Oman. And Qatar is in no position to do that. So it more or less now falls on Kuwait's head. But Kuwait is not a mighty power. And Kuwait's ability to be influential with Iran and with Saudi Arabia is very limited. It will take something like the United States, maybe with our European friends and maybe with Russia and China, to put together something that I think could usefully bridge the gap. Over here? Yes, way in the back, and the microphone is really close to you. Thank you. Can you help with the microphone, please?
How do you see Russia?
You might speak closer to the microphone and maybe I could hear you a little better. I'm a really old guy, so I have trouble times.
How do you see Russia to fulfill and replace the American power in this vacuum that is created in the Middle East?
Okay. Well, Russia, how do I see Russia in relation to American power and the role in the Middle East? And, of course, that's my next lecture when I come back again in 15 years. Well, in all honesty, U.S.-Russian policy is fallen into the same rut as U.S.-Iran policy. We, in fact, don't have a policy. We have a posture of demonization. And for both countries, it's a posture of mutual demonization that is painting a picture of the other side as black as we can possibly make it. This has meant that there is almost no communication. With Russia, this is even more serious than Iran, because both Russia and the United States possess enough nuclear weapons and the methods to deliver them, not only to destroy each other, but the planet. And so that deterioration in relationships, even if it has nothing to do with Iran, is a serious mistake. Russia is a principal supplier of military equipment to Iran, particularly high-quality modern air defense equipment. The United States doesn't like that. That's an area of difference we have with Russia. Russia and Iran are cooperating, at least in Syria, although they have differences about how things should proceed, And I have, as I said a moment ago, differences about which one should be number one with President Assad in terms of influencing the region. I believe that for a peaceful settlement in Syria, Russia, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the United States are all necessary. But absent any one of those, particularly the United States and Russia, it's highly unlikely there'll be any real progress made. Russia right now, in looking at that situation, and perhaps Iran, believe they have made considerable gains on the battlefield and want to continue to see whether the battlefield will produce the victory they hope for. That isn't helpful, and it's not helpful that the United States, as I said a moment ago, is unwilling to be part of that kind of negotiating arrangement, in part, I think, because of its distrust of Russia and Iran, and in part for reasons that have to do that this is such a hard and difficult slog that we are not likely to get anywhere very soon. Finally, as you know, the president originally decided to remove all U.S. forces from Syria. He's changed his mind, and he will keep a small number of forces there, partly to guard against a return of the Islamic State people, partly to keep our foot in the door, and partly to, in one way or another, provide support to our Kurdish allies, who have been very helpful, but won't on their own, I think, be able to withstand Turkish opposition when and if it comes. So it's complicated, and I hope that's a useful answer to your question. Back here. Ladies first. Thank you. Ladies first. Thank you. Good.
Hi. Hello? Andrea Whitmore, United Methodist for Cairo's response. Ambassador, do you see any hope at all for the Palestinian people?
I wish I could tell you I'm overwhelmed with hope and a super optimist. I used to think that was the only way you could look at these problems. At the moment, I think that the changes that have been made unilaterally by the United States, particularly those in support of a changed situation on the ground in the region, are working against any kind of early opening of a process of dealing with a solution. And I get frequently asked, I was on the radio this morning, isn't the two-state solution dead? And I have to tell you, it is pretty hard going for the two-state solution. But the alternatives are not alive either. The alternatives being a one-state solution in which Israel pushes the Palestinians to Jordan, or a one-state solution in which the Palestinians push Israelis to the Mediterranean, or at least Jewish Israelis. And none of that's going to happen. And as a result, the status quo is continued occupation, which in my view is still unacceptable. And so there we come back to the two-state solution. The two-state solution gets increasingly difficult because for Israel at least, it's not a saleable commodity to either Prime Minister Netanyahu or to the right-wing support that will assure him, I think, sufficient votes both directly and in a coalition to be the next Prime Minister of Israel. But don't count your chickens here either way, because Israeli politics is as volatile as any I've ever seen. And between now and April 9th, all kinds of things could happen. So it remains uncertain, but that's the general direction in which it's going. And of course, the Palestinians are divided between Hamas and what used to be Fatah, the PLO. That does not look like it's going to be patched up soon. The Arabs have a position, but so far they haven't wanted or been at least moved to make it clear. And so Prime Minister Netanyahu is really counting on the deal of a century to come forward, perhaps after he's formed his coalition, and he'll wait for the Palestinians to denounce it and say, well, I can accept it with the 124 changes I have in mind. But that, I think, is a posture that one way or another may well be at this stage an outcome of where we are, unless the Arabs are prepared to go back to the plan that they all approved, which is essentially a plan to exchange territory for peace. And we'll have to see where it'll go. But distrust is rampant. Differences are severe. They are growing. And so I have to tell you that I don't see an early possibility of concluding here an arrangement for the Palestinians in the region, which is fair, equitable, secure, all the things that we have always stood for. Over on this side, please.
Thank you very much, Arasadi. Very much enjoyed your elegant talk, all the information and eye-opening.
Well, all of your kind comments gratefully received. Thank you.
So, Ambassador Pickering, do you believe, or can I know your opinion about the parameter of demographics globally? We are talking about youth in Tehran, Riyadh, Washington, D.C., and all of these major areas that we are talking about, Moscow, and the information technology and the fact that we are blissfully doomed to have a distillation of ideology and an expansion of understanding between our youth who are maybe teenager right now, and in 15, 20 years, they're going to run on the fact that we cannot go on any other path other than coexistence. I want to get your perspective if demographics and time is on the side of humanity in the big picture.
Look, I agree with your objective, and I agree with your conclusion that there is no result that I think in one way or another is going to be achieved by the use of force to make it happen, good, bad, or indifferent. It won't have any capacity to endure if it's forced on one side or the other. I think secondly, I would love to join you in a feeling that today's youth are tomorrow's leaders. And we hope indeed that is the case. And I find today's youth, and I'm familiar in my country, and I'm familiar with some, but not nearly to the same degree in the region, have the capacity both to understand this problem and move ahead. They have an enormous amount of material crashing in on them on a regular basis. And one has obviously a tremendous challenge to know and understand what is truth under these circumstances and what is false. And so the problem of the determination of truth has become in many ways much more complex and much more challenging. I hope that they're up to the task, because if present generations of leaders seem to be incapable of solving the problems, then we are thrown back, just as your question implied, on the youth for the future. And I hope they will be. I had opportunities today to talk to high schoolers and university students, and their questions were clear, they were intelligent, they were informed, and they were challenging. And I hope, in fact, that the region can have the same thing. Because without that, we are digging bad holes deeper. And George Shultz, when he was Secretary of State, used to say to me, the first thing to do when you're in a deep hole is to stop digging. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
I have a question for you.
Yes. Can you speak close to the mic?
Okay. Is that
Great.
better? Okay. The first question is the Trump administration's policy towards Iran, which does seem baffling. What is your own understanding or speculation about what the administration is about there? My first question. My second question is, it's been suggested that possibly the United States would do better to edge away from its two chief allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel, because of human rights concerns about both. And it might be better not only for the United States, but for those countries. What's your opinion about that?
Okay. The second question is basically, we have human rights problems with both Israel and Saudi Arabia. But I'm not sure what the question was. Should that influence our approach to them, or should we abandon them and go find somebody else? What was the question?
I heard it suggested that perhaps a little bit possibly closer
Okay.
I'm asking your opinion.
Sure. My view is that if we put all our eggs in one basket, we lose our capacity to be a leader and a solver of problems. And so putting all of our eggs in one basket, wherever it is, needs to be balanced by, I hope, opening the door in the other direction. Now, one of the major problems, both in Israeli attitudes toward Iran and Saudi attitudes toward Iran, was they believed the nuclear agreement was the first step in a new American romance with Iran, which would end up in Iran being the hegemon in the Middle East. A huge jump from where we were, and I think not wisely conceived. But even Saudi Arabia has internal politics, as does Israel. And so one can't divorce attitudes like that from the process of either consolidating or winning power. And I think that plays an important role. Now remind me again of your first question.
About the Trump administration policy.
Okay.
What if your own
The easy answer to that is I don't know. It doesn't show what I would call the kinds of signs of coherence that one could analyze it and develop the strategy. It seems to me to be strategyless and purposeless, with the possible exception of doing something for the president in terms of his interest in serving the country for another 4 years. Yes, sir.
Carl Forsberg. Okay, Carl Forsberg, University of Texas at Austin. Thank you for your talk, Ambassador. Can people hear me?
Yeah, you're okay. Thanks, Carl. Go ahead. I got you.
In the 1970s, you had your first ambassadorial assignment in Jordan. This goes back to the issue of Russia's influence and the lady's question to your response about potential for the U.S. and Russia to collaborate. In the 1970s, when you were in Jordan, Henry Kissinger had the choice for U.S.-Soviet collaboration in resolving certain issues in the Arab-Israeli peace process, and instead made the decision that the U.S. would essentially make itself the indisputable mediator in the region in a way that defined the Soviets out of the region. In the 2010s, in some ways, it almost appears the Russians are following Henry Kissinger's playbook. Do you think perhaps Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's Middle East strategy is in some ways the same as Kissinger's, to make Russia the indisputable mediator in a way that defines the U.S. out of the region?
I think it's an interesting question. And I think that Mr. Putin, for Russia reasons and reasons having to do with maintaining his popularity high in Russia, would like to be seen as winning the contention with the United States in Syria or any place else. The really interesting problem is, now having invested something in Syria, can he produce a result which helps him rather than a stalemate which doesn't? I don't know whether we're going to have a continued stalemate or a brilliant military victory on the ground. Putin seems to be betting on the latter, but if the former bites him, then I think we're back to the old paradigm that neither of us can settle it alone, but we have some maybe outside chance of working it together. And it may be that the forces that compel diplomacy as opposed to conflict could be useful in enlisting themselves on the side of that approach. But that is, in my view, logical and rational, but not necessarily true. And so we'll have to wait and see. So my answer to you is wait and see. It could go one way or the other, and that might actually change the relationships and shift the balance. It's quite clear right now. I think even if the Russians were to come to us on their knees, I'm not sure we would respond. And part of that, unfortunately, is, I think, the mistake of demonization, which has cut off contact and which has left us in a situation where most Americans think there can never be any redeeming virtue in Russia. Yes, sir. The microphone will come down here. These ladies work to rule, so the lady on the right can only hand the microphone to the right. The gentleman down here at the front, and the lady on the left can only give the microphone to the left, but that's okay. We'll work out the system for you in the future. Thank you.
My name is Hassan. My name is not Thomas. Your name is Thomas, and it is not Hassan. Someone may talk about our discussion, saying Hassan talked to Thomas and Thomas talked to Hassan, then there is a problem. Let's call each other ambassadors. Okay. Ambassadors are talking to each other.
I've abandoned the title, so you can call me Tom, please. Good. Okay.
You know what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to make questions the way his question about the Persian Gulf. No better than anybody else. That all the assets throughout the Persian Gulf. Never been called Arabian Gulf. Well, when we change names, perhaps there is some intention. I'm not talking about you, but my question is this. What do you think is the policymaker's intention of changing this name from Persian Gulf to Arabian?
But I think that those Americans who change the name like to do it when they meet Arabs. And they like to change the name back when they meet Persians. And it's as simple as that. And I wouldn't lose sleep overnight at some mysterious plan somehow to steal the Gulf from you, because in all honesty, you only own a little bit of it under international law, not the whole thing. Similarly, the Arabs only own a little bit under international law, not the whole thing.
My question was Arab first. General global things, those things.
Those who change names for particular purposes, I think, superficially have the idea in mind that I gave you in my first answer to your question, to be nice to friends and to treat friends respectfully. Okay. Yes, sir, right here.
To what extent
What happened to the microphone? Okay. We'll let this gentleman come, and you have a lien on it for the next go-round if you'll let this gentleman have it. Okay? That's how diplomats solve problems.
So, how much goes from power? Really,
Yeah.
Okay. How much of the U.S. foreign policy, the way it's constructed, formulated, and implemented, is based on individual wishes, that is, president in particular? How much of that is the decision made by the structure? That is, by structure, I mean ensemble of powerful forces, people who don't even know that influence decisions, constructive defense, foreign policy, economic policy, et cetera, et cetera. I personally believe that it's really the structure that compels individuals to behave in a certain fashion. And that, of course, is based on a well-planned national interest. If we could call it global economic interest, national interest, which I really don't believe anymore. I don't believe that corporations have any sense of nationalism or patriotism. They pursue what's good for them. Having said that, so do you see this as a pattern since the Truman era? For instance, in Latin America, we see...
We don't need for instances. I got your question.
Yeah.
Is policy solved by the president, by the bureaucracy, or by some combination?
I was going to say that there's a pattern. Latin America, Middle East in particular. I really think that there is this war of attrition against countries like Iraq. That ultimately the purpose is to dismantle that theocracy.
All right, let me start now to answer your question. This lady should get her microphone back. Thank you very much. The American Constitution says the president is the chief executive, commander-in-chief. The president decides foreign policy. Presidents each have their own method of doing this. This president seems to me to be very much, I decide, and doesn't seem to be interested in listening to anybody else. President Obama was perhaps way over on the other side. He wanted to hear from everybody, but then he made up his own mind, and it took sometimes a long while to get there. In some levels of policy that are not so important, the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense in his area can make policy decisions, and sometimes even lower down in the bureaucracy. So it depends on which policy is being decided and what the Secretary of State or the President want with respect to the level at which it is decided. And so there is no, in my view, consistent pattern. But the normal, which we are not seeing now, is that most presidents really want to know what the professionals think. They often want to know what their party believes. They want to know sometimes what the House and Senate think. And they want to know, because they have to decide that, is it good for my reelection if they're in the course to contest another election? Those are all elements that are there. The bureaucracy is not concerned with reelection. That's the president and his political advisors, and perhaps the Secretary of State. But the others, in my view, would do well to listen to the people who have long expertise in the region. I said listen to, not necessarily be chained to their points of view. And often it's an amalgam, a combination of those particular set of arrangements that is the basis for making policy. So it is complicated, it varies. There is no single one approach, but this president seems to me to believe himself uniquely capable of knowing everything and solving all problems alone. Yes, please, because I promised you. And so you can call in your lien.
Thank you. I'm going to be really close to the mic. My name is Ella Rose with Burns McDonnell, and I just wanted to know if you felt how, or your opinion, if there was more female leadership in the region, how this narrative you're telling us today would change, and could that be a potential narrative for our future?
Yeah, look, I believe in diversity. And I believe, in fact, that gender differences, ethnic differences, what we call racial differences, all bring different aspects of thinking about problems to the fore. I believe that women can be as violent as men, but it is not the cultural tradition to be so. And I think that serves an advantage, because I think violence has to be the last resort in defense and not used as a way of proceeding in trying to find answers to problems. It's something I'm very much concerned about. I don't mind pressure, but I don't want to use violent pressure if at the end of the day you're depending on that to produce capitulation by the other side or having to resort to wars of choice. I think they're a serious mistake, and the fact that we are 17 years in with one and 18 years in with another with no clear result speaks for itself. So I agree with you, and I think there should be no bar, but indeed an open path for anybody to participate who can obviously pass the exam for my foreign service friends or enter into politics and get popular support and come to the fore. And there should be no artificial barriers for that. So thank you for your question, and I hope now you've got your lien, but I hope you also got support for your point of view. Thank you. Thank you very much.